Hey, this is the scientist here. I'm going to do a quick sort of overview of the breakbeat parent genre. It is kind of the smallest of the main parents, which would be house, trance, techno, downtempo, and such. Breakbeat is going to be one of the smaller ones, and it's got a lot more hybrids where it sort of goes into different parent genres at multiple spots. So I'm kind of trying to make a map. The map in itself is so confusing just because so many things break off or split off. So I'm going to kind of go over it just real quick, hopefully within the 10-minute span I can. First, real easiest step to find out where it started is in Brooklyn, on the Brooklyn rave scene, and specifically Frankie Bones helped sort of kick it off. There were what was known as Bones breaks, which were sort of sped up hip-hop and acid breaks. And really Frankie Bones kind of started it off. There are some other split-offs in there, such as Success and Effect. That should not be hip-hop. That should be breakbeat. Frankie Bones and Lenny D. How and Little. And there were other things that were not breakbeat that were part of that as well. But really kind of started out in America, in Brooklyn. And that's kind of where you do want to start off. And then really from that point on, when it's specifically breakbeat, would be breakbeat hardcore. And that is, again, you have sort of sped up breakbeats. Generally, breakbeat is going to be in the 120, 140 range when you start talking about as a genre. Below that, you get into downtempo. Above that, you get more into hardcore and to drum and bass. So very much the tempo is a huge part of that. So UK breakbeat hardcore is really the first breakbeat genre and in the UK. And then it speeds up and it splits. So let's talk about that. So it speeds up and splits, becomes darkcore or the early form of jungle. And then that becomes drum and bass, speeds up and splits and becomes the happy equivalent, the opposite of the darkcore jungle, and goes happy. And that goes into hardcore. And then it stays around the same speed and becomes big beat in the UK. So this is it sort of staying the same. These are it splitting off and becoming basically different genres at that point. But UK breakbeat hardcore is really where you have these three genres taking off, both drum and bass through jungle, specifically darkcore, through hardcore, the happy side of it, and then staying the same speed and staying breakbeat and becoming big beat next within the UK. And then this is sort of where... So Brooklyn rave, and it kind of dead stops. It's not enough in there that you could say it's a subgenre of its own. It's more sort of rave, breakbeat coming out of rave. And same thing with the San Francisco rave scene. So you do have in San Francisco where they were using a lot of breakbeats as well. And really sort of the progressive breaks came out of here, especially... with some of the Hardkiss brothers and their label. And then, so a lot of progressive breaks came out of this, and a lot of the coastal breaks. Coastal breaks is the American side, which is really the West Coast side. But they had their own rave scene going on in America. And, there was a little bit of cross-influence on there from the UK, where the UK... did a fair amount of artists that came over with that. But breakbeat as a whole could be seen as a little bit more of an American scene and a UK scene, but not a European one. Really, it's between those two countries, the United Kingdom and United States, that really were both involved with breakbeat, but otherwise it's not something that really took off in Europe as a whole. So going back over here, so from the Brooklyn rave scene and the San Francisco rave scene, you have progressive breaks comes out of that. And that really goes into progressive house and trance, kind of a crossover. And that's sort of used in progressive house and trance sets. You wouldn't say that there's too many at that time progressive breaks artists, although later in the 2000s, as house and trance take off to a bigger scene, you could see artists be using breaks. But, Sasha and Digweed initially were using a fair amount of progressive breaks early on. And a lot of that came out of the San Francisco rave scene. So you'll see a lot of that taking place. But then let's go to sort of the American side at this point. So West Coast breaks, Florida breaks. I initially called this funky breaks, but that really isn't used per se. But you've got West Coast and you got Florida. Some of that can be seen as funky breaks, acid breaks, chemical breaks. And you can say that chemical breaks or acid breaks are kind of used by both sides of the ocean, where, you have like Fatboy Slim, Chemical Brothers on their first albums using a lot of acid lines, obviously Josh Wink, and then a lot of the West Coast breaks and the Florida breaks using it. So it's kind of used more as an adjective, less as a scene, because it's used on both sides. But you could do like an acid breaks set list, and it would cover both sides of the coast on there. But Crystal Method, you would see on the West Coast breaks. Big one, Dub Tribe, Basement Twins, Electroliners, Uber Zone came out of California, so that would be a part of that. And then there's a fair amount, Simply Jeff, and there's other parts on there. Florida breaks, you're going to see a lot more of DJ IC, Dynamics on there. Rick West did a fair amount of these. So if you take a look through this is really trying to take a look. And I recently sort of redid this, looked over a lot of the different compilations present here, which represent the American side of the breaks equation going on. DJ Micro, Adam Freeland. So there's a lot of depth in there, and most people forget about the American side and just focus on big beat. And definitely the big beat side is probably the most well-known version, and that's more UK style, even though Crystal Method was a part of that, Propeller Heads, and it's very diverse scene within that, each sort of giving their own particular part on there. And even Fatboy Slim, you've got funky breaks, you've got acid breaks, and a lot of different things going on. But eventually Big Beat sort of ran out of steam, and then New School breaks came out of that, and really sort of stepped away from what Big Beat was doing and added a little bit more of a new school style going on. And you could see out of that where it's a step away from what was going on and a little bit more sort of what drum and bass was doing. In fact, New School breaks kind of splits off to what's known as Tear Out breaks. And that is a set that's coming up soon. But really that's sort of like slowed down drum and bass, where it's more right around 140 BPM. But it sounds very much like sort of the tech step of its time, and sort of a drum and bass sound. And then you've got a lot of little things going on here, a lot of dead ends, to be honest. With Big Beat, you've got Hard Hop, sort of was a very brief split off from Omar Santana, where it's basically just Omar Santana under a bunch of different aliases, and it's just big hardcore style Big Beat that was just meant to just sort of punish you. And that really, he's a hardcore producer who got involved with breaks and did his own thing there. And that kind of dead end. No one really else sort of named it that or did that. And then you have Hardcore Breaks, which is sort of looking at UK breakbeat hardcore and sort of redoing it with sort of modern techniques. And that sort of died out. That was a very brief scene on there. And then you have stuff like Break Step, which was a crossover with UK Garage going on. But New School Breaks was really the next big breakbeat scene after that. And with Tear Out being the drum and bass equivalent of that. And then there was a lot of stuff that sort of broke out of that. As I said, Acid Breaks was kind of both sides on there. Left Field Breaks is sort of a little bit more crossover into sort of the down-tempo scene, with they're sort of sped up, but they're sort of weird. They're not necessarily designed for big the big style of big beat, but a little bit more weird crossover on there. And I might do a set for that to sort of say what the other fields are. But that, you pretty much put under breaks, but it's not the traditional style big beat, new school. It's a lot more weirder. So it works a little bit more like an adjective on that. And then funky breaks, which is a little bit more funkified, a little bit more fun. Fatboy Slim obviously did some stuff like that. But then a lot of Americans did as well. And then that sort of splits into new funk, where you actually even have bands and people playing their instruments, and it tries to step away from breaks. And then you have ghetto funk, which sort of took some of the energy out of that, the slower BPMs going on, but then sort of added dubstep wobbles and such like that. So, and then a lot more hip hop feel to that, because really, the break beats are sort of sped up hip hop break beats. So there's always a lot of crossover on the lower BPM end going on. And then on the other side, you've got other stuff going on besides the newer version of new school breaks. You've got tech funk, which is sort of the crossover between house and techno, and really crossing it over into a bunch of other outside influences and really crossing out of the breakbeat scene, but still using a little bit of breaks within that. And so, breakbeats are pretty confusing. A lot of crossovers, a lot of split-offs. But I would say the biggest thing you want to take away is the UK quotient going on. Then you also have a lot of the American side going on here between coastal breaks, Florida breaks, and other stuff going on. And then there's just been a decent amount of stuff going on outside of it within the last decade with new funk, ghetto funk. Let me go back over here. Ghetto funk, new funk, tech funk, funky breaks. So those have been really in the last decade, including new school breaks. And then psy breaks, just so we go over that just real quick. That's more, again, on the progressive house trance side. There was a very early version of psy breaks within the 2000 era, very briefly within pretty much the psytrance in family. And then there's psy breaks over here, which really became its a couple different labels doing, but sort of splitting off from progressive breaks and doing a little bit more psytrance crossover from there. But again, within the progressive house trance wing over here, where they could be easily used within sets or particular DJs using. So I hope this helps. Obviously it's confusing, but that's how genres work. They don't necessarily go nice and cleanly a lot of the time. All right. Thank you much.